In March of 1944, residents on the block of Rue le Sueur in Paris noticed that there was smoke seeping into their homes, and it had been happening nonstop for almost a week. At first, no one knew where the smoke originated from, until one night a gentleman walked across the street to confirm that it was coming from the chimney smoke of a 2.5-story townhouse at 21 Rue le Sueur. He rang the doorbell and no one answered, so he called the police. Two officers showed up, and after asking folks around the neighborhood, they verified that this address belonged to Marcel André Henri Philippe Petiot, a family physician who was married with a 15-year-old son. He actually lived at an apartment nearby, just a 15-minute bicycle ride away, but he was indeed the owner of 21 Rue le Sueur. Police called him at his apartment to inform him of the urgent situation. Petiot's first reaction was, "You didn't go inside the house yet, did you?" The officer said, "No, but you need to hurry over here so we can get in and put out the smoke and the fire." Petiot said, "Okay, I'm on my way." The two officers waited, and when the doctor still hadn't arrived after half an hour, they called firefighters for help. A fire department corporal and a small team showed up and made their way into the property by climbing through a second-floor balcony. In the dark and with flashlights on hand, they made their way down to the basement where the smoke and a strong odor was apparently emanating from. In that basement were two iron stoves, one of which was burning intensely. When one of the firemen opened the door of that stove, a charred human hand popped out. As they rotated the flashlights around the room and other parts of the basement, the light would expose a pile of skeletal remains, including skulls and a rib cage. Entire arms and legs, and even a split torso were found nearby. The source of the unusual and nauseating smell was now obvious, and the corporal ordered his team to retreat back outside right away. Outside, the fire corporal advised the two police officers to come in and take a look, warning them, "Gentlemen, I believe that your work will be cut out for you." Dr. Marcel Petiot, he had already been guilty of embezzlement and stealing and various financial frauds throughout his entire life. But what those firefighters discovered in that basement that night would unravel his worst crimes yet. And so began the extensive and exhausting journey for the investigators and the rest of the world to figure out and learn who this man truly was. Marcel Petiot was from the town of Auxerre, located almost 100 miles southeast of Paris. Born in 1897, he was the first child, and 9 years later, he would be joined by his younger brother Maurice. Both of their parents worked at the local postal and telegraph office, and when Marcel was 15 years old, unfortunately, his mother would pass away due to complications from a surgery. At that point, he and Maurice moved to live with their aunt and uncle. Growing up in Auxerre, Petiot did get into some minor trouble at school and at home, but his biggest incident would come at the age of 17, when he got caught and arrested for stealing mail. Allegedly, he was trying to steal the cash out of those packages. As a result of this offense, a psychiatrist examined the teenager and concluded that he was suffering from a hereditary mental illness. Petiot ended up completing his equivalent of a high school diploma by being homeschooled by his uncle, who happened to be a math teacher. And then on January 11, 1916, he had enlisted in the military and formally began his training. World War I, also known as the Great War, had erupted 2 years prior with Germany attacking from the border of Belgium, as part of a plan to rapidly advance into Paris and take over the capital of France. However, this intended invasion wouldn't be so easy, and instead, German forces ended up in a back-and-forth daily battle along the trenches of the Western Front, where Germany and France would each suffer almost 1.5 million military fatalities, in addition to 3 million wounded on each side. The young Marcel Petiot was thrown right into the middle of this violence and destruction. It was likely he was unstable to begin with, and the combat experience only made his condition worse. 1 year into his service, a doctor stated he was dealing with mental disequilibrium, neurasthenia, depression, melancholia, obsessions, and phobias. He completed his final tour of duty in September 1918, at which point Germany was formally acknowledging that after sacrificing millions of their own young men, the front line was still just as far away from Paris as it was 4 years ago. As such, the bloody battles of the Great War came to an end on November 11, 1918. Meanwhile, Petiot continued to be admitted in and out of hospitals, where he was diagnosed with mental imbalance, sleepwalking, melancholia, and depression marked by a tendency towards ideas of persecution and suicide. Other doctors thought he was faking the symptoms just to avoid combat. Regardless, the end result was that Petiot was honorably discharged from the military and put on disability pensions, receiving permanent government benefits for his psychiatric condition. After the military, he entered into an academic program designed to help veterans transition back into civilian life. He studied disciplines including anatomy, physiology, and dissection, completing his thesis and receiving his degree from University of Paris in December of 1921. The newly licensed doctor settled in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, about 25 miles from his hometown, where he began attracting clients by offering many appointments for free. What he actually did, though, was sign them up. He signed everyone up for a healthcare program where the service provider would be reimbursed by the government. So in the end, he was still getting paid. It's just that none of his patients knew that they had been added to this program. So everyone thought that Dr. Petiot was providing all this treatment at no cost out of the kindness of his own heart. In any case, he ended up building a thriving medical practice because of all this. He made lots of money, and then he went out and bought a yellow Renault 40 CV. And that would be just the first of a few sports cars that he would own. Around the time he turned 30, he married Georgette Lablé on June 4th, 1927, and they soon had one child together, a son named Gerard. By then, he had gotten into politics under the Socialist Party, which was rising in popularity all over France. He ran for the 1926 mayoral election in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, winning by a landslide. Later in 1931, he also won a seat as councillor for the Department of Yonne, which is similar to being a member of Congress in the United States. However, during his terms in office, he would be accused of some rather strange thefts, such as taking funds and various physical items out of City Hall, stealing a drum out of a music event, stealing cans of gasoline and oil, and even building some kind of wire and cable system where he was redirecting electricity back to his own house. In other words, he was also stealing electrical power. Because of these bizarre scandals, he would be driven out of office. He would eventually lose his seat as mayor and as councillor, and that would put an end to his brief political career. However, in the middle of all that, while he was still mayor, he was actually suspected of even more disturbing allegations. On the evening of March 11th, 1930, a dairy farmer named Armand Debauve was rushing back home after being told his dairy was on fire. When he arrived, he indeed found his house burning, and even worse, his wife was lying on the kitchen floor with fatal trauma to the head. Investigators said the fire was an arson, and that his wife, named Henriette Debauve, had probably been attacked with a hammer, and there was a hammer on the property that was now missing. At first, there were no suspects or witnesses, but a freelance and unnamed reporter for the local paper, Le Petit Régional, was writing articles on the case with a degree of investigation and detail that baffled police. Authorities had no idea how this person had access to some of the information they were describing and having published. The author even found the murder weapon, the hammer, in a river near the farmhouse. Many years later, it would be revealed that the person writing these news reports was Marcel Petiot. Eventually, one potential witness did start to say that he did see Petiot that night at the farmhouse before the fire started. That person was known as Old Man Frascott, who was actually one of his patients. A few weeks after Henriette Debauve's murder, the two men were hanging out at a hotel bar, just having some drinks together. I don't believe they were even talking about the case at that time. But Frascott was complaining about some pain in his joints. His physician suggested to go with him to his office down the street, where Petiot could treat the pain with an injection of a new drug that he got from Paris. Old Man Frascott agreed and went along. Then, 3 hours later, he was dead. The only person who was going to potentially testify on a homicide suspect was now also deceased. The coroner's examination for Frascott made no indication of foul play and didn't mention any chemical or substance that could have killed him. The cause of death was just attributed as an accident, a heart attack, or some unknown side effect of a hypodermic needle. And that put an end to any follow-ups on that entire case. But who was the medical examiner for the town of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne? Well, it was a local physician and mayor at the time, Marcel Petiot. Entering the summer of 1940, the Nazi Party had now seized control of France's neighbors, successfully taking over Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. As German forces moved their way into France from all directions, millions of people all over the country were trying to escape by vehicle, by bicycle, by train, by foot, by any means necessary. In Paris, more than 2 million out of the 3 million residents had left. On June 9th, even government officials in the capital began to flee to head down south. Members of the Jewish community who remained in France would have most of the rights taken away, and were now prohibited from being employed in many industries. Worst of all, more than 75,000 Jews, including children, would be rounded up and transported to Auschwitz and other concentration camps. What Germany tried and failed to do in the 4 years of the Great War, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had just accomplished in 6 weeks. To many scholars, the next 4 years would make up the darkest era in the history of Paris. For Marcel and Georgette Petiot and their teenage son, the nation's capital had been their home for several years already. Dr. Petiot had once again established a lucrative clinic with a regular flow of clients coming to see him every day. In May of 1941, he bought an additional piece of property in Paris at 21 Rue le Sueur, which he said would operate as a mental institution after the war. That year, he would spend 3 months renovating it. The front of the house would be a 2.5-floor main building. From the streets on this side, you couldn't see behind this main building, where there was actually a courtyard in the middle of the premises. On both sides of this outdoor area, the walls lined up against the adjacent homes would be stacked up multiple stories high. According to Petiot, to block out nosy children, nosy neighbors, and to protect the privacy of his patients. On the other end of this courtyard were several smaller buildings, one of which would contain the room to serve as his consultation office. Connected to this consultation office was a tiny corridor, and connected to that corridor was a tiny triangular room, about 8 feet long on one wall, and then about 6 feet long on the other 2 walls. Now, the walls of this triangular room were very thick and practically soundproof, and then if you go inside that room, there was practically nothing inside. There were no windows, no furniture, except for a plain metal cot. Against one wall, there was mounted a pair of metal shackles. And then the doors for this triangular room, there was no doorknobs from the inside. So there was no way for you to get out and open the doors if you were inside. And on the outside in the corridor, there was a small window, a peephole, that allowed you to peer into this triangular room. Marcel Petiot claimed that this space was designed to monitor and administer patients who would undergo electrotherapy. As far as the clinic he already had operating elsewhere in Paris, there he had almost 100 patients who came in regularly who were registered by the state as drug addicts. Petiot claimed he was running a detoxification program where he was helping these individuals slowly wean off their substances. One of these patients was a co-delivery man named Jean-Marc van Bever. He had been arrested by a task force that was cracking down and targeting suspected drug abusers in Paris. Van Bever would confess that he and his girlfriend had successfully obtained prescriptions of heroin from Petiot. As a result, a trial was set where he would obviously have to address these charges that his physician was overprescribing narcotics and thus trafficking and profiting from the sales. Such a witness testimony would have led to Petiot's medical license being revoked and possibly even prison time. However, on May 22, 1942, just 4 days before that scheduled trial, Van Bever would vanish without a trace and never be found. The trial proceeded without him, and Dr. Petiot's penalties for the offenses would end up being a mere fine of 2,400 francs. Aside from that, his most sophisticated hustle during World War II would be his self-proclaimed leadership in the resistance network and being a fervent fighter for the dignity and safety of France. He would tell all his clientele that he had the resources and connections to provide someone a route out of France with all the necessary paperwork for full migration and immigration into Argentina. For this arrangement, he would charge each person tens of thousands of francs, and he would go under the codename Dr. Eugene. And for a commission, he also had a couple of accomplices and recruiters working for him, and they would refer escapees to him. One of his recruiters introduced him to Joseph Rieucroux, also known as Joe the Boxer, a longtime gangster who had warrants out for his arrest, and more importantly, who was being sought after by Henri Lafont, a much higher and more powerful leader in the Parisian underworld. Apparently, Joe committed a set of robberies without consulting or seeking the approval of Lafont, and hence he was now in deep trouble with his criminal boss. As such, Joe the Boxer, along with his associate, a pimp named Francois Albertini, and their respective girlfriends, Claudia Chamoux and Annette Bessette, both of whom were sex workers and mistresses, all 4 of them agreed to take up the services of Dr. Eugene. With Joe carrying almost 1.5 million francs on him for his journey, they met with Dr. Eugene in 2 separate groups in October and November of 1942. After these 2 couples supposedly departed, word got around town regarding this escape network. And more of Joe the Boxer's associates would find and approach the recruiters, including Adrian Estebetege, who made similar mistakes by taking stolen gold and then reselling it for personal profits instead of turning it over and reporting it to his gang. He also committed robberies without clearing the jobs first, and now his ruthless boss Henry Lefant was coming after him too. So Estebetege brought his subordinate with him, Joseph Prergy, who at the time was operating a brothel for German soldiers. Like the previous group, these two men were joined by their mistresses, Giselle Rosny and Paulette Grepé. They had hundreds of thousands of francs on them, as their plan in South America was to launch a new brothel together. These two couples met with Dr. Eugene around the end of March 1943, and like Joe the Boxer's group, that was the last time anybody would see or hear from them again. Ultimately, though, the majority of people who met with this doctor only to vanish permanently, the ones most willing to take the risks and comply with such clandestine terms, those would be Jewish individuals and families desperately trying to get away from the threats of the Nazi occupation. In fact, Marcel Petiot's first known victim was one of his patients, a Polish native named Joachim Gushinow, previously an owner of a leather and fur shop. In October of 1940, like thousands of other Jewish business owners, he was mandated to sell his shop to a non-Jew at a reduced price. As an immigrant, he also faced additional discrimination, specifically targeting foreign Jews, and where they would be gathered and handed over to Nazi officials for transfer to concentration camps. So on the night of January 2nd, 1942, Gushinow packed up a combined 1 million francs worth of cash and jewelry. He had dinner with his wife, kissed her goodbye, and then went off to meet with his physician for what he thought was going to be his trip to safety. Later that summer, on the morning of June 20th, 1942, Dr. Paul Leon Braunberger was at home when he received a phone call from someone reporting that another person was in distress and needed attention. Although this caller didn't give any details on who that other person was, their situation or their symptoms, or even an exact address to meet at. Under normal conditions, such a phone call would be deemed as suspicious. But for a Jewish resident at that time, it was actually necessary to be very secretive about where you were going or who you would be seeing. A Jew could be captured for any reason while they were out and about, as French police had to meet a quota of arrests to satisfy German authorities. Dr. Braunberger's wife, Marguerite, said he seemed to recognize the caller, and they agreed to convene at a metro station. So her husband took off, and then, starting later that day, a series of letters would arrive to Marguerite, with the author addressing oneself as Dr. Braunberger and saying he had to suddenly flee, urging his wife to pack their most valuable possessions and arrange to follow him in this escape. Mrs. Braunberger found his unexpected departure, as well as the letters, to be extremely disturbing and out of character for him. In the end, Marguerite Braunberger never heard from her husband again. That summer, French police ramped up their efforts, culminating on July 16, 1942, also known as Black Thursday, when nearly 13,000 Jewish men, women, and children were seized and placed into Volodrome Bever, a sports stadium in Paris where they awaited processing to be transferred to a concentration camp, and where they spent over a week without basic access to food and water provisions. The Neller family narrowly missed being apprehended, the only reason being that Kurt and Greta weren't home when the police raided their neighborhood that day. As German natives, the couple fled their homeland in 1933 after Adolf Hitler rose to power. Kurt Neller was actually very proud to have moved to France and was fighting to become a French citizen. Even 2 years into the occupation, he had no plans to leave the country until the frightening ordeal of Black Thursday changed his mind. He made the arrangements with Petiot, who was his physician. Kurt Neller's close friends and godfather to his young son, René, expressed concerns about how suspicious Petiot's escape network sounded. Even though Neller agreed, all he had to say in response was, "But what else can I do?" And so, by July 18, 1942, the family of 3 with all their valuables gathered with them were picked up by Dr. Petiot for their supposed departure. While France saw 25% of its Jewish population being captured, in the neighboring occupation of the Netherlands, the rate was a staggering 78%, accounting for nearly 110,000 Dutch Jews who would be rounded up and deported to concentration camps, and making the persecution of Jews in the Netherlands the worst across Western Europe. Lena Wolff and her husband and mother-in-law lived in Amsterdam from 1936 to 1942, initially hoping that it would be a safe haven. Like the Nellers, they were originally from Germany and had to escape once the Nazi Party gained control of their country. Before Amsterdam, they stayed in Paris briefly, and after, they went through Belgium before returning to Paris again in September 1942. By this point, they had changed their last names multiple times so Nazi officials couldn't track them down. But everywhere they tried to hide in Paris, German authorities would eventually end up raiding it. Until one day, they were introduced to a woman who gave them a room in her apartment building, and then also referred them to Dr. Eugene for a path out of Paris. Dr. Eugene came to meet the Wolff family and go over the plans. Then, in late December of 1942, with all their belongings, including diamonds and jewelry, Lena and her husband and mother-in-law were picked up by a horse carriage, the horse making its way to their destination of 21 Rue le Sueur. By the spring of 1943, the Gestapo, Germany's undercover police force, not only were they aware of Marcel Petiot and his alleged supposed role in the resistance network and arranging escape routes, but they were already in the process of trying to catch him in the act. The story of how Yvan Dreyfus got involved in all of that started back in the United States, where he has studied engineering. Like Kurt Neller, he was a Jew who was very proud of France, and in his case, that was his home country. So despite how dangerous such a move would be, he actually returned to France, arriving just before the Germans invaded. In an effort to join the French army based out of London, he sought the help of a guide to escape France in early 1943, but that guide turned him into the Germans instead. As Dreyfus was imprisoned, his family tried to buy his freedom with an offer of a ransom payment. A Gestapo official stepped in to accept the ransom under one condition. He had to go undercover posing as an escapee to help them nab the suspect known as Dr. Eugene. On May 20th, 1943, Gestapo agents monitored and followed Yvan Dreyfus as he met with Dr. Eugene. But the pair managed to evade detection somewhere along a metro station. The agents lost track of them, and that was the last time Dreyfus was ever seen. The next day, the Gestapo raided Petiot's apartment, and he was dragged away to Fresnes prison, 7 miles away from Paris and at that time, the largest prison in Europe. While incarcerated, he admitted to being part of the resistance network, but said he wasn't the leader. He claimed to be working under another leader who he had no way of contacting or finding. It's not clear what the Gestapo did or didn't believe about what Petiot was telling them, but on January 13, 1944, after his younger brother Maurice paid a ransom of 100,000 francs, Petiot was released. And just 2 months later, on the night of March 11th, 1944, after receiving a call from police about the chimney smoke roaring out of 21 Rue le Sueur, Petiot rode over to the townhouse in his bicycle. When he arrived and met with the French police officer there, he introduced himself as the brother of the owner of the property. He started going into how they were resistance fighters and even insisted that the human remains found in the basement belonged to Germans and traitors of France. Now, the French police officers, apparently they were sympathetic enough to the cause of the resistance that they might have gotten distracted or whatever. But the point is they didn't bother detaining this man for questioning. And so, Petiot ended up leaving the scene of the crime, he rode off on his bicycle, and he wasn't seen again for quite some time. Meanwhile, more investigators would show up and begin searching inside. Towards the back of the property at the triangular room, they found the window, the peephole which actually came with a telescopic lens. Detectives believed his victims were tortured inside that chamber, and he used the lens to watch them slowly die in agony. In the kitchen, a wide counter was installed with a large deep sink. Allegedly, this was where Petiot dismembered the bodies. In a stable on the backside of the courtyard, there was an opening on the floor that led into an underground pit, roughly 10 feet deep. There was a ladder as well as a pulley with a hook and rope, allowing for someone to lower themselves or something else down or pull something up. Inside the pit was a pile of human remains, soaking in quicklime, which was obviously used to break down and disintegrate the decaying flesh and tissue and bones. And of course there was the basement in the main building in the front, where 2 furnaces were used to cremate many of the body parts. Dozens of suitcases, luggage bags, and parcels were also recovered, some of them found at 21 Rue le Sueur, while other bags came up in the search at the Petiot couple's apartment. Yet more of these bags were located at another property, belonging to a friend of Maurice Petiot. Maurice had transported these items and belongings from 21 Rue le Sueur to his friend's attic, where that friend agreed to store all these bags for him. Maurice and Georgette, along with the friend who owned the attic, as well as Petiot's accomplices and recruiters, everyone was detained and interrogated at some point. But each of them would deny having any knowledge of any crimes in terms of robbing or killing anyone. And since none of them had any info on Petiot's whereabouts, the prime murder suspect in this case wouldn't be found anytime soon. Beginning on D-Day, June 6, 1944, Over 150,000 troops from the US, the UK, and Canada stormed onto the beaches of Normandy, engaging in yet another violent and deadly battle with German forces. But in this fight, Allied forces successfully penetrated the shoreline, marking a turning point in pulling control of Western Europe away from the Nazis. The US Army and other Allied units made their way to Paris by August 19th, inspiring the military division of the Resistance to stage an uprising. This led to a battle within the French capital that would end with Germany surrendering the city back to France. And so 6 days later, on August 25th, 1944, Paris was finally liberated from the occupation. Resistance was an underground newspaper that published its first issue a few months after the Nazi Party invaded. With Marcel Petiot still a wanted fugitive, they decided to publish an outrageous headline to see if this would get the suspect to come out of hiding. On September 19, 1944, an article appeared in Resistance with the title, "Petiot, Soldier of the Reich." Surprisingly, this tactic worked. Petiot was so offended at the headline that he sent in a handwritten letter to the newspaper, which arrived just a few days later. A professional graphologist examined the message, comparing it to Petiot's known handwriting, and concluded that the letter was indeed genuine. So, they published Petiot's response on October 18, 1944, in which he reiterated his commitment to the resistance and denied ever having worked for the Germans. The fact that Petiot's response arrived so quickly convinced detectives he was still hiding out in Paris. One of the investigators helping to track down Petiot was Captain Henri-Jean Valery. He was stationed with the resistance group in Rue, which is a commune in central France. One of his subordinates there had some tips and leads as far as where Petiot was staying, some new apartment that he was staying at, as well as his daily commute through the metro. So, another resistance agent tried to follow up on these leads, and on October 31st, 1944, they were able to locate Petiot at the Saint-Mandé-Tourelle railway station, and he was finally apprehended there. But to everyone's surprise, Captain Henri-Jean Valery and Marcel Petiot turned out to be the exact same person. In other words, Petiot had arrived and showed up to this resistance group in Rue, and he basically infiltrated the group, posing as this other person, Henri-Jean. And somehow he was able to gain access into their meetings, into their office for the past month, pretending to work and pretending to investigate to basically try to catch himself. And prior to all that, for many months, he had been hiding out at a friend's apartment in Paris. A few days later, resistance agents handed the suspect over to police, and on November 2nd, 1944, the suspect was finally in the custody of authorities in Paris. Under questioning, he once again repeated his story of being a committed and passionate resistance leader, and that he never killed any innocent people except Germans and traitors. But consultants brought on to help with the interrogations, and they were resistance fighters themselves, spent 6 months interviewing Petiot, only to conclude on May 3rd, 1945, that Petiot was not at any time in serious contact with any resistance organization whatsoever, due to his contradictions, his glaring ignorance of the structure of a resistance network, and mentioning only resistance comrades who are either dead or who cannot be found. The murder trial began on March 18, 1946. Without enough evidence linking his wife, younger brother, or even his recruiters to any of the actual killings, all charges were dropped against these parties. Marcel Petiot was a single person on trial for 27 counts of homicide. Dr. Albert Paul, lead forensic scientist, gave a testimony on his team's findings regarding the remains that were recovered. He estimated at least 10 victims were involved, but suspected many more because of the volume of hair that was also found. Although some of the body parts were intact enough that they could determine the gender and the approximate age and some physical attributes, ultimately there was no conclusive details linking any of these physical remains to an exact match of one of the missing persons. This was largely due to the fact that some of these corpses had been in the basement or pit for a long time, having reached an advanced stage of decay already, on top of being disintegrated in the quicklime or broken apart in fragments, and even burned away. In addition to all this, most of the internal organs had been removed and were not recovered, so it was impossible to examine those organs as part of an autopsy or toxicology analysis. Because of all this, Dr. René Pédelev would go on stand and reiterate Dr. Paul's testimony that it was impossible to provide an estimate of when each victim died or how they died. During the testimony of toxicologist Professor Henri Griffon, he discussed some theories around possible poisoning of the victims, but again there was no conclusive evidence. In the consultation room at 21 Rue le Sueur, a gas mask was found, suggesting perhaps that the victims were killed inside the triangular room which served as a gas chamber, and this was also mostly just a theory. In the end, the prosecution relied heavily on the luggage bags, suitcases, and the personal belongings found inside those bags, where family members were able to go on stand and confirm items and articles of clothing recovered from the possession of Petiot that matched what their missing loved ones owned. At 21 Rue le Sueur, for example, a black satin dress was recovered, and it still had the smell of perfume on it. The designer of that dress told police she had sold that dress to Paulette Grippet 3 years prior. There's no reason Grippet would have left behind this dress or the many other items she brought with her to travel, suggesting she never departed anywhere after arriving at the doctor's townhouse. On April 4th, 1946, after just over 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found the defendant guilty on 26 out of the 27 counts of homicide. Denise Nellie Houghton would be the only case for which he was acquitted. During her disappearance, Houghton worked as a model for Lancel and had gotten married exactly 1 year prior, living with her husband's family in the village of La Nouvelle Garnière. Shortly after the wedding, she discovered she was a few months pregnant, and the rumors that she traveled to Paris by herself once to get an abortion, and then a second time to secure a certificate confirming she never had an abortion. She left for the second trip on June 5th, 1942, and was never seen again. For the other 26 counts that resulted in a guilty verdict, Petiot was handed a sentence of capital punishment. In the courtyard of Prison de la Santé in Paris, the convicted mass murderer was executed by guillotine on May 25th, 1946. And today, 80 years later, what do we have to say about this case? Well, on the one hand, it still stands out as one of the most shocking, most infamous, and most gruesome murder cases in the history of France, and it was a huge media circus at the time. But on the other hand, if you really think hard about what Marcel Petiot did, as far as taking advantage of the chaos and the confusion and instability and the lack of structure during wartime Paris, and how he targeted the most desperate and most vulnerable populations, and he turned that around just for his own personal profit and gain. If you kind of think about his crimes from that kind of perspective of exploitation, and then you go anywhere in the world during any time period when there was ongoing conflict, and let's say we have a microscope that could expose everyone at all times. In reality, I think unfortunately we would then kind of discover and learn that throughout history, we've actually had many different Marcel Petiots. And on that high note, that's my 2 cents on this case. I hope you enjoyed my deep dive, and I want to thank you for tuning in. I hope to see you again on the next episode. Thank you.